Asha. I have mostly worked on creative tools in my career, primarily been a PM, but also spent some time as an engineer and as a designer. So I thought it would be a good talk to hone in on how to build great creative tools. I lived in New York for the last 8 years and actually just moved back to my hometown, which is in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I'm working for a startup here, so it's really cool to be able to connect virtually. I saw that there's a lot of people from all over the world. So yeah, excited that we can connect. So let's dive in. This is a quick bio on me. These are the different companies that I've worked for. It's been a mix of early stage startups. I was at Venmo when we were 5 people. Customer.io, also really early, which is an email marketing company. And then larger companies like Squarespace and Etsy. So Hopscotch, that's a programming app for kids. And it's probably the most complicated creative tool I've ever worked on. As you can imagine, building a programming interface and making it easy enough for kids is pretty challenging. So I'll dive into that. Currently, I'm at a company called Jobber. It's a Canadian startup that is focused on what we call field services. So imagine contractors like who are coming to your home to do a home renovations project, or landscapers, or like plumbers, HVAC, basically making software for them to make their flow easier. They're one of the kind of last segments that hasn't really digitized their workflow. So it's a pretty interesting segment to be working on. And then previously I was at Squarespace in New York for the last 2.5 years. I think you probably all know what Squarespace does. It's a website builder. I would say the best website builder, but yeah, so I worked on the website product when I was there. And then Tim and I worked at Etsy together as well. So there'll be questions at the end. If you have questions about any of these other companies, definitely happy to chat. But primarily I'll be talking about the creative tools. So that'll be Hopscotch, Jobber, and Squarespace. All right, so thinking about creative tools, I wanted to start with what I've seen as what are common hard questions when you're trying to build a creative tool. And also, just to note, I think I'm using the term creative tools, but I think any tool that is complicated, and a lot of the SaaS that we build is complicated, hopefully this stuff will be relevant for you. So the first thing, I think this is really the thing that stands out for me, is that constantly you're trying to balance power and ease of use. So we want our tool to be easy enough for anyone to get started with. So a novice who's never built a website should be able to use Squarespace. However, we also want it to be powerful enough that your advanced users can actually make interesting outcomes. So you have to balance that power and ease of use. And that's a big theme of what we'll talk about today, and how I've tended to do that in the past. But it's really important, you kind of, for a healthy community, you really want both of those users, because the power and the advanced users end up lifting your whole community and actually lifting your product and making more interesting outcomes. So it's the first kind of hard question that I see. The next thing is that often when you're building complex tools, there's parts that are interconnected. And so sometimes it can be hard to think about, well, how can I actually build this incrementally? I have to build the whole system at once. It's going to take 2 years to actually launch the thing. And so we'll also talk about how can you approach this in an incremental way so that you don't get stuck into that pattern of not releasing for years. And the last thing I've observed in this realm is that often you want to make your tool flexible enough that it will allow for what I call emergence. It'll allow for interesting use cases that you've never thought of, because definitely when you have good tools, this happened with Squarespace a lot, this happened with Hopscotch and happened with Jobber, where if you have good tools, your users will always surprise you and they'll use your tool in interesting ways. So you want to design for that emergence. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this in the work you do as well. So those are the three hard questions that I wanted to answer. And then basically there's 4 tenets that I want to walk through in this presentation. So the first thing is that creative tools, I think it's really useful to actually think of them as systems themselves. This might be easy, might be kind of obvious rather, but it's really important to understand that you are probably building a lot of relationships between things, and it's important to be able to think holistically about a system and the deeper parts. So when you're building tools, you almost kind of want to make sure you're thinking about it as a systems design. The second thing is, and I'll show examples of each of these, but the second thing is building modular and chainable features. So I'll talk through that. The third thing is, once you've done that, it's really helpful to be able to package those things up into what I'm calling user-friendly templates. It doesn't always have to be a template as you've known it, but basically, how can you package up that modular level to be more easily used by a novice user? So basically abstracting complexity so that you have another level that other people who are not maybe as advanced, can interact with. And the fourth thing is just, if you're in the space of building tools, I think it's super important, again, this might be obvious, but super important to actually always be observing the outcomes of your tools. At Squarespace, we were constantly looking at the websites that people would actually build. At Jobber, it's the same, Hopscotch, it was the same. This helps you really identify gaps and unknown kind of hacks that you can lean into. Okay, so I'll walk through each of these in more detail. So the first thing, creative tools, important to think of them as systems. So yeah, I basically, this is a sort of a simple point, but I do want to make it because sometimes what can happen in larger organizations is you have a bunch of teams that are actually working on a system, but they're working too independently. And so then it really challenges the holistic view. And you bump into a lot of like kind of org issues. So if we just take Squarespace, take a website, for example, we divided our teams somewhat functionally and somewhat by design. So we had a header team, for example. So they were focused on all the different layouts and content that you would have in a header. So it's like navigation, social links, buttons, cart, logo, that kind of thing. And then we had a sections team. And so the sections, like on this page, there's basically 2 sections. There's that banner section at the top and then a text section below. So we had a team that was focused on sections. We had a fonts team. So they're thinking about size of text and font face, including font faces and buttons. And then we had a colors team. So obviously the thing that's tricky about all of these teams is that they are very interconnected, and they need to work together. And so it's important that you have either someone on your team, either a director role or however it could be, is thinking at this like systems level. So I think that's one definitely big learning. Need to think about how all these parts are connected and the relationship. If you poke here, something else is likely going to poke out. So it's important to have that holistic view. So second thing, building modular and chainable features. So this is an example from the company I work at right now, Jobber. So as I said, Jobber does field services. One of the tools that we provide is a quoting tool. So an HVAC would come to your house and they would offer you different air conditioners, for example. This can happen in landscaping packages, lots of different industries, but basically they're trying to get you to upsell, right? So this was a situation. Our current quoting tool was really, really, really basic. We didn't have any of this functionality. It was basically just a list of line items, a text list. And so we were asked to, like, we did some research, found that this would be really valuable, but this is a lot of new complication. And so we want to step back and think, okay, what's the best way to approach this? So what we actually ended up doing was breaking apart that overall kind of good, better, sorry, let me go back one time. Let me explain this term because I didn't know it before, and it comes up in this presentation. So trying to get you to upsell an air conditioner, they'll often call it like good, better, best. You see this in pricing too, where you just offer 3 different options, and then you try to get people at least to pick the middle option, but hopefully get to push them to the top tier. So good, better, best quoting is the name of the feature that we were trying to figure out the best way to build. And so what we did was actually coming back to the modularity idea, was we broke it up into its modular components. So the first thing that we were missing, like I said, we just had a text list. The first thing was, well, we need some logic to be able to have something selectable or not, basically just make something optional. And so we released that as a separate feature. And then we also needed to be able to add images. So we released being able to add an image to your line item on your quote as a different feature. And so what was really nice about this was, instead of that big kind of bucket of idea, we instead broke it down into different features, and we could release them incrementally. But also what was really cool is that we saw all these different use cases that we wouldn't have able been to arrive at had we just focused on this like one good, better, best idea. So here's an example. So basically the modularity enabled a lot more outcomes. So we did see good, better, best. We saw people using it in that example. Here, this is a roofer. And so this is a different types of gutter systems for your roof. But another use case that we saw, we call it choose your style. And so with the combination of that optional logic plus images, we actually saw people now using this tool to offer different stylistic choices to their clients. So do you want a copper trim? Do you want a bronze or an iron trim? So that was a cool use case that we could not have intended, but given that we built it in a modular way, we enabled. This is a very funny picture, but this is another example of, given that we just added that optional feature, we allowed people to tack on simple add-ons to their quote. So arborists are a common customer of ours, and to removing a stump is something that is often like an option. And so that has nothing to do with good, better, best quoting, but it allowed a completely new use case. So in summary here, modularity can allow for a variety of outcomes, and it can allow for this idea of emergence, which can be really exciting and I find very interesting. It also allows for incremental development. And then I think the downside of a modular approach is that while you're giving the building blocks to your customers, they actually have to piece them together, right? And so you're still relying on the user to be sophisticated enough to understand how they can piece the things together, so that you're leaving the complexity up to the user. So that's where the next thing comes in, which is if you have these modular components, what you can then do is you can package them up together into templates. And so basically this is the idea, you can abstract that complexity away into templates. And I think this is kind of the most important thing that I've seen with creative tools is you almost want to have 2 levels, just like as a designer, you have a concept of progressive disclosure. You almost want to have 2 levels of working with a system. You could work at the lower level, so the module level, or you're working at the higher level, which is that abstract layer that you never even have to get into the weeds if you don't want to. And so I'll show you a few examples of this. So Hopscotch is a programming app for kids. This is, I think, again, like I was saying, it's actually one of the more complicated tools that I've worked on. So I'll just walk you through this video here. So when you get started at Hopscotch, imagine you're an 8-year-old kid, you're trying to learn how to program. It's already a very daunting task. And so what we have here is a good good example of abstraction. I mean, it's a programming language as well, so it's pretty handy, but I will show you. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're going to add, we added a little circle, you saw that, and then we're going to basically add a program, add some rules to this circle. And so what we did in Hopscotch was you can make your own rules from scratch saying when the game starts or when the game is playing, do X. That's a lot for a new user to do. So instead, what we have are these, I will call them, they're a version of templates, but basically they're a packaged up version of rules that you could interact with and you don't have to know all the complexity. So let's just show you, you're adding a mirror rule, for example. Play the game, this is what it does. You can move your finger around on the phone and it creates kind of like this cool mirror effect. So it's cool to be able to do something as engaging and interesting as that without actually having to understand all that lower level complexity. But if you wanted to, you could then open up that rule and you could see, okay, this is where there's all the details of like the complexity. So this, I thought this is a really awesome example just to illustrate that 2 levels. And so you can see how this would be quite complicated for a new user to get started with. So really, they're probably never entering in that level. Okay, Squarespace colors. So this is another example of multiple levels of abstraction or complexity. So let me just play this one. So when you get started with Squarespace, we offer you a color palette. And then you can change that color palette if you want. Oh, sorry. Sensitive. Okay, so you can go in here. So this is the first level. It's like you can change the color palette. You could imagine that we could have shown you actually like a color wheel here. That would be like the lowest level, but obviously that's not super user friendly. Colors are really hard to get right. So we don't want user to have to make all those decisions. So how can we abstract that up, make it less complicated and more user friendly? So we have these designer palettes for you. You can pick one. And you can see basically the full site is changing. There's a concept of an accent color that we came up with, which was just the buttons and some headlines. And then, so let's suppose we go with this palette. Notice there's a pink theme going on. Then you can actually, if you want to go again into the details, you can. And this is what makes the tool really powerful. So now you're seeing all of the different elements. You're able to color all of the different sections or the different elements of that section. So here, if we wanted to actually make, oh yeah, sorry, I just played around with this for a second. So if we want to make the section background just as an obvious change, I think here's also another important part of our creative tools. Again, like we're not showing you all the complexity, we're progressively disclosing always. And so that allows you, okay, you could do it dark, or finally you get to the color wheel and then you could choose this awesome orange color. So that's another example. The quintessential example of this is Squarespace templates in general. This is definitely one of the big things that helps Squarespace grow and become popular, because obviously building a website is really hard. And what we find what's interesting is that people don't change templates that much, right? So there's people who are just really operating at that template level. And so this is packaging up all the colors, the styles, the sections, what pages should be on your site, packaging all those things up so it's really easy for you to get started. Yeah, so that's the idea around packaging up things into useful templates. And then the final point I want to make is just this may be obvious, but I do find that you can enter project orgs and it's not always the case, which is just always be observing the actual outcomes that your users are creating. So this is an example from Hopscotch, which is just, we used to play the games and all the time and try to understand what cool hacks people are doing. This is a great way for you to figure out what to build next and what kind of trends you can lean into. And for me, building creative tools, this is kind of the most satisfying, fun part, is that you get to see what people have actually made. And it can be really cool to see what you've empowered. So to summarize, when you're trying to build great creative tools, I think the first important thing is to realize that you're building this system and to think of it as a system. Make sure you understand what the interconnections are between different parts. The second thing is, where as much as possible, almost follow principles of good code, which is build modular things that can be chainable, modular things that have that are useful in their own right, but then when you chain them, they can actually accomplish something much bigger. And then to help your novice users or your less tech savvy users, it's really useful to be able to package up those modular features into some notion of templates and abstract some of that complexity away. Didn't mention this before, but obviously this is a layer where you could also rely on your community. You could have user generated templates, and then that allows you to open up and provide way more range of functionality to your users. And then finally, just always be observing. Great. So that's it. Would love to take any questions you have now. I'm just not sure. I will stop sharing and then we'll go back to Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Asha. So many great insights. I see someone's already found it in your Zoom thing window. There's a Q&A feature. If you use that, you can also use chat, but it's a lot easier for us and for Asha to cherry pick the questions. If you can just add your questions into the Q&A panel.
Yes, that'd be great. Okay, first question. When you step into a new team or new product, what is a good step to start? Awesome question. I always start with research. Like for me, it's really important that I understand what users are doing today. So for example, with that quoting, so I just joined Jobber, as I was saying. I worked at Squarespace for the last 2.5 years, and I just joined Jobber a few months ago. And I was sort of tasked to help improve quoting. And my first step there was that always be observing. So I basically looked at probably over 500 quotes from what people are currently doing in our product. And there I saw, I don't have it on me, but there I did observe a hack where people were, again, we didn't have any, it was just a list of text items really, where people were calling something optional and they were making it $0. So it was an indication that, okay, this optional idea actually might be useful. So I think for me, it's definitely like, try to do as much research as possible. And for me, that's both qualitative research at scale, which is like, yeah, can you look at 500 websites, look at like 500 payments, whatever it is. And then I also always rely on interviews as well. Try to get some insights first on my own, and then I always will do some qualitative insights too. Hopefully that's helpful. And by the way, I don't know if people have used this tool, but if there's questions anyone wants to upvote, if you don't necessarily have a question, but you want something to be answered, you can upvote it too. And that way it will go at the top. Otherwise, I'm just going to go down the list here. How did you decide to go work with Jobber? How do you determine that the team is going to be a good fit for you? Yes, really, really good question. I think it depends on what stage you're at in your career. You're probably going to be looking for different things. Early on in my career, I think as a product manager or as a product person, the most important muscle for you to be developing is your ability to make decisions, because decisions is really like that's kind of our currency as PMs. So I think if you are working, I almost would prioritize working at a startup or some environment where you have a lot of autonomy, you're able to build quickly and make a lot of decisions. Because I actually think even more important than brand is for you to hone that muscle. And so that was what was important to me. Customer IO was basically that place in my journey where I was able to make a lot of decisions quickly. But now coming back to Jobber, I was looking for a company where I could grow in a leadership role. And Jobber sort of at the point where hasn't crossed the chasm, but the segment in general is pretty interesting in that it has the potential to. And so I was excited about the industry opportunity, and also the company is quite small. And so I was excited about the leadership opportunity too. But yeah, I think it really depends on what stage you're at in your career. And then like the interview is as much for yourself as it is for whomever, you know, like team fit is critical. Being able to learn from your team and having mutually beneficial skills is really important. So I would definitely do due diligence of interviewing them as well. Okay, Rim has asked, what will be the best way to move from development to product management? Yeah, so I actually had this experience. I started out as an Android dev. That's what I did at Venmo. And then I always was more interested in strategy and product work, to be honest, but dev was like my path in. So I think that you're in a really great position if that's what you'd like to do. I think it's just it's about starting to get involved in the product decisions, right? And starting to ask questions about the product direction. You're lucky in that you're probably exposed to all the product decisions that get made. So I would start to exercise that opportunity to kind of ask more questions and get more involved. You could even start to be involved in some of the research. If your PM is doing research and designers, like asked to tag along. And you can just start kind of developing your own product sense and go from there. Tim, let me know if you have anything to add too, because I know Tim has he has a lot of insights in these things too.
This is your time, Asha, not for me.
Okay. Just trying to look here. Okay. Okay, you've talked about the two ends of the user spectrum, SaaS products, experts and novice users. What are some of your insights and learnings around the users that might be somewhere in between? Okay, or have you found the users don't tend to exist? Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, it's not such a polar space. There's going to be a range and it's going to be a gradient. That said, I do think it's useful to when you're building the tool itself to think in those two levels, because it's almost like you want to make sure you're designing for these extreme use cases. And if you're kind of just in between, you might be someone that dabbles in the lower levels every once in a while, and then operates at the higher levels at other times. So I guess the answer is, yeah, I'm sure there's a gradient, but approaching it like trying to be solid for both experts and novice means that you will probably fulfill that middle case as well. How does the modular approach affect internal productivity? I'm thinking concepts like design systems plus shared code reduces 100%. Yeah, like obviously everyone in the engineering team is like, well, duh, this is how we write code anyway. So I think the modular approach is very powerful, and it allows you to reuse components potentially. But in particular, it allows you to release earlier, and especially when you're developing creative tools, it's really hard to know what people are going to do. You have some sense of the outcomes, but it's pretty hard. So releasing earlier just allows you to stress test and learn more. But yeah, I think that in terms of development, I've always seen that as well. It allows for sort of more iterative development. Okay, I'm going to scroll back up to the top. Oh, that one was voted. Oh, okay. This is a good question. Baran, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name properly. As a former developer and a new product person, I am having difficulties to transfer information to our designers without suggesting solutions. Any recommendations? This is a great question. I face this all the time. I think in general, in the product space, there's a lot of creative people that we work with, and it's often the case, including myself, where you can get kind of romanticized with solutions. So a technique that I have is, well, one, you definitely want to step back and think about, okay, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? But particularly when you're trying to give design feedback, I find it very useful to just ask questions. So try to frame the critique that you have in terms of a question, and see if it would lead someone to that same result, or kind of seeing that, oh, okay, actually this isn't going to work, and this solution is going to break down, so we need something else. But I think for your own sake, it's really useful to be able to think up back into the problem space. What is the problem here? And then how can you ask a question that would hopefully allow them to see that there may be a gap in the solution? Wait, how do you manage solution suggestions from stakeholders who may or may not be end users of the products? Yeah, I think this varies a lot. So managing stakeholders are very different across different companies. I've been at companies where they're very much opinion run and very much like stakeholder run. And I've also worked at companies where stakeholders will give you ideas, but they by no means think that they're the expert. You're the person that's working in the area, so they trust that you're the expert. So I think the first challenge is identifying what type of stakeholder you have and what culture you're working in. Unfortunately, if you're in a culture that's very driven by stakeholders, it can be difficult to go against the grain. But I think generally, if you're really having a situation that's very led by stakeholders, user testing suggestions. So if they're really pushing a suggestion, actually doing some user tests to see if it's valid or not. Otherwise, again, I would come back to the problems statements of like, okay, well, this is the problem we're actually trying to solve. And sorry, it's funny to talk about this stuff in abstract, but come back to the problem statement and see if like what they're suggesting actually lines up to that problem statement. But the other thing is stakeholders often, they can have good feedback. Like for example, at Jobber, the co-founders are still running the company, and they know a ton about our users because they've worked in this space for 8 years. So I think it's great to just develop a relationship of trust. And the way that I've mostly tried to do that is through research and showing insights of research. And then once you start to develop that trust, then you can have more independence and still take stakeholder feedback when it makes sense, but not have that direct you. Okay, let's see, I'm gonna scroll up the top. Okay, oh, we did that one. Love to hear your experience for the best ways in which product and UX teams should work together. Oh, this is a tough one because again, it really varies so much from team to team, person to person. I have a bit of a design background, so my designer and I pair quite heavily actually, because that's just the type of PM I am. I know that there are PMs that are maybe more business focused and will leave the design really up to the designer. But I think to start, like what I always, again, it sound like a broken record, but I do think it's true, is really making sure you're clear on the problems you're trying to solve, like crystal clear on what are the problems you're trying to solve here, because we all know that features can go in every which direction. So having clear problem statements and having a clear list of the scope, like what is what is actually in scope and out of scope before anyone even designs anything. I think that's just a critical clarity that you need. And then it's nice to always come back to that, because then if scope actually changes, apart from that list, you should know, you have a record of something to come back to. But yeah, I think clear definition, and asking the designer questions, I think, is really useful. Instead of making suggestions, I think asking questions. And I think it's a relationship that takes time. Like as a PM, you're always doing this, right? You're always trying to build relationships of trust. And so I think it takes a bit of time, but that to me actually is probably my most important relationship, is my one with my designer. Okay, any tips for first-time PMs charged with rebuilding internal tools, i.e. business requirements most already exist, but prior tools has a poor user experience? Oof, this is a tough job. Yeah, so I think the first thing is how broadly, how much consensus is there at the company that the user experience is actually poor? If there's a lot of broad consensus that's true, then you're going to have more leeway. If that's not true, and you really think it is, then you're probably going to have to do some work first just to prove that it's not great. Or it's useful for you to do research anyway, because then you'll really understand what are the biggest gaps. But then I think you're in a challenge. This is a challenging thing to do, because it's either, there's kind of two routes, right? Like you try to incrementally improve it by building pieces. And I guess, I hate to use this example as in a product, but I guess Jira and Atlassian has done that, where they improve incremental pieces. Or you go for a complete rebuild, which is obviously a big commitment from leadership to make. But it would give you the leeway to actually build the user experience that you want. What I would probably suggest is, like, how can you do a bite-sized version? So find a really small component of the tool that you're working on, and maybe really commonly used but small component, and just try to improve that one thing, and then kind of build trust and go from there. Okay. Okay, based on your experience having worked in startups and mature orgs, so I'm just starting in product management, which you think are better and why? Yeah, I think this comes back to my earlier point around, like, I think especially early on in your career, you want to be shipping as much as possible. You want to be shipping, if you want to really be great at building products, that is a different skill than being great within an organization. Both really important, especially if you have ambitions of working in large organizations. Both really important, but quite different skills. And Tim, who's someone who's worked at smaller companies and larger companies, can also probably speak to this. But I definitely am. I love building stuff. I love product. So for me, I really wanted to, like, get my hands dirty and build as much as product as possible. So I had the option of kind of going with a bigger brand, well-known brand, or going with a company that no one had heard of, Customer AO. But I learned so much at that company. I was the first employee, and did the design and the dev, the front end dev and design. And I was just exercising that decision muscle all the time, and we were shipping all the time. And so I got much better at my product sense. My product sense just, like, got way better. So I think it kind of depends. Like, if you really love building product, I would try to find a startup that you believe in. And if you can, you'll be in a much more fast-paced environment. Yeah, and then on the other side of it, like, going to Etsy and Squarespace, it was the first times I worked at larger companies, and that's a whole different skill of negotiation and, like, how to manage stakeholders and how to work within this, like, messy network of both, like, a visible org structure and then the invisible org structure, right? So they're both two important skills. I just love products, so I thought it was always important to work at startups. Okay, what else we got here? Thanks for all these questions, guys. It's really fun to do this. Okay, what if the project is small and it's hard to collect the numbers after finish the product? Would you suggest how do you determine success? I guess it depends on like how small we're talking. Because often, even if 30 people are using something, you can look at what they've made and see if it's sort of working or not working. Yeah, actually, I feel like for qualitative measures, even if it's pretty small, you can usually get an idea. But it's more like if you're trying to change something like conversion rate or these numbers that you need a lot of scale for, like some metric in your funnel where you need larger numbers for. I guess it depends on what you set out from the beginning. Like for this quoting tool, for example, we wanted our success metrics were we wanted 50% adoption for optional line items, which is really high, but we had a lot of confidence in it going in. We actually got 60%. And then we also wanted people to be using it at least in the ways that we thought. So be using it for a good, better, best quoting. So yeah, if you don't have a huge scale, I think you can still determine what your success metrics would be up front. That would make sense even with a smaller team. And percentages obviously can be useful there. So I feel that's helpful. Okay. Oh, cool. These questions are being answered. Okay, I see how this is working out. How do you balance keeping the user journey straightforward for non-experts versus exposing more complex features in those, if those are revenue driving features? How do you balance keeping the user journey straightforward for non-expert users versus? Right, this is a really good question. That's a really good question. I guess the first thing would be, okay, is it important for the complex features? I guess my first question would be like revenue alignment. Like, does it make sense that we have to have those complex features be the ones that are driving revenue? Because yeah, if you're packaging up those features into a version of templates, then the novice users would also be using those features, so maybe they'd also be paying for them. Yeah, this is a good question. I think overall, it's like you want your journey. People will be willing to pay for something if there's a very short like time to value, right? Like if pretty much instantly from the time they open up your product or get signed up with it, they're finding their own value in it. So I think as long as that is true, then it's easier to convert people. So maybe that means exposing, changing what actually people pay for. I'm not sure. I have to understand that one a little more. Okay, how do you rebuild trust with stakeholders or users when a project fails? I recently took over a project with a long history and I'm trying to turn it around. Okay, I'm assuming we mean there that the long history is not with you. You're taking on the project for the first time. So you have a blank slate with like stakeholders, I'm assuming. Okay. Well, one, I would really understand. Yeah. So I think the first thing is like really understand what went wrong. Was it a communications issue? Is it actually a real product issue? Understand what the problem is. Is it like a conception issue of how people talk about it within the org? So yeah, you get a really good grasp of why we think it doesn't have this good reputation. And then um, I would just take a pretty kind of structured approach of like, okay, these are all of the reasons why we think that this project has not succeeded in the past. And then these are the things that we're going to be doing differently in this approach. I think if you're a new person on the project, you at least should have an advantage of that. But yeah, probably identifying that you really understand what went wrong previously is important, and then how you would do things differently this go around. And having users, obviously, it's always useful to have users back up your approach. So yeah. Okay, how do you differentiate a senior product manager and director of product role specifically at a startup? When we're interviewing for someone's role, how would you determine if someone is a fit for director versus senior PM? To me, so one, I would say, I guess the nuance does matter. I'm a little bit of a person of like, okay, does the title matter that? But I do think you're right. There's a difference between director and a senior. Director is someone to me who can define a vision. You don't need to really tell them a roadmap in any way. They can tell you like, where to play, how to win. They can tell you what segment to go after, and they can come up with a roadmap for it. So a director is someone who really, it's almost like they're running their own P&L. Versus a senior PM, I would say a senior PM is usually someone who needs a little bit more guidance on the roadmap. And once you give them kind of a direction, like, hey, we should move into, and maybe for Squarespace, it's like we think we want to offer more powerful image filters or something like that. They would be able to execute really well on it, but I think the roadmap and identification is something still that I would depend on a director for. So how would you determine someone is a good fit? Yeah, so then I think you would probably want to get at that aspect of, can they set a vision? The other thing about setting a vision, it's obviously one thing to be able to set it. It's another thing for people to want to follow that person and want to be excited to work with them. So being persuasive is a really key component of a director role. So I'd also think there should be some like presentation component. But yeah, maybe you can look at an analogous product and ask them to kind of come up with a roadmap in some part of that area, and then present on it. Yeah.
Awesome,
Cool.
Asha. The questions just filled up the time perfectly.
Yeah, that was great. Lots of questions. I feel rapid fire there, but hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for taking the time to answer all of them. Much appreciated. So, Andy, anything you want to chime in on? I was just going to wrap up and tell folks what's next.
No, go for it.
Okay, cool. Firstly, thank you again, Asha. Really appreciate you joining us. Your afternoon, my evening, other people's whatever time of day. So really appreciate it. I just wanted to give you guys a preview of what is coming next. So next month on August 19th, we have Tara Goldman, who was the VP of product at General Assembly. And she's going to talk about a topic that many people are probably struggling with right now, is how to succeed in a new remote product role. So I'm really excited to hear her thoughts on it. She just recently took a new job pretty much while the pandemic was happening. And so I think there'll be lots of great learnings from her. So thank you again for joining us tonight. Hope to see you on August 19th, and have a great evening.